All right, well, welcome. My name is Dan Russell. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Arizona, and I'm a member of the Arizona's Center for the Philosophy of Freedom. And today I'm glad to be speaking with Matt Zwolinski.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad to be here too. I'm Matt Zwolinski. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at the University of San Diego and a co-director of USD's Institute for Law and Philosophy and a graduate of Arizona's PhD program in philosophy back in 2003.
Yep, good. Now, Matt, I want to talk to you today about an area of expertise that you have that's a bit unusual. You've become an expert in something that might seem unusual to a number of people. Maybe it seems unusual to you. You've
Expert in
become an ex
exploitation.
You've
Yeah,
become an expert not at exploitation, but on exploitation.
I'm working on that.
There's an important difference. Um, in particular, you've written quite a bit on ethical issues about surrounding the use of sweatshop labor and so-called price gouging. And so I'd like to talk to you about both of these forms of exploitation today, starting with sweatshops.
Great.
Okay. Now, I suppose like most people, I've always thought that sweatshops were a great deal if you're a consumer and if you're a manufacturer, but a terrible deal uh, if you're a laborer. It looks like a zero-sum game. Someone is getting rich and off of somebody else through exploitation. So it's surprising, and I think it's going to surprise a lot of people to find someone like you um, defending uh, the use of sweatshop labor, at least in some respects. It looks like you've got the wrong side of the argument here. So I'd like to start by asking you, why would anyone defend sweatshops in the first place?
So for me, and this sounds paradoxical, I realize it, but I defend sweatshop labor precisely because I think it's good for the workers. I deny the claim that it's a zero sum interaction. That's often what we think of when we think of exploitation. We think of one person gaining at another person's expense. But not all exploitation is like that. Even if sweatshop labor is exploitative, it's exploitative in a way that's mutually beneficial. So that, yeah, of course, employers gain, of course, consumers gain from the employment of sweatshop labor. Labor is cheap, lowers the cost of goods. Uh, but it's important to recognize that workers gain too. And in fact, precisely because workers are in such a desperate situation antecedently, they're very poor, they have very few options. That's why sweatshop labor looks attractive to them. Precisely because they're that desperate, they have typically much more to gain by sweatshop labor than the employers gain, so that the wages that they earn by working a sweatshop job compared with the wages that they would earn elsewhere in the domestic economy are much, much higher. And because they're so poor, that increase in wages can make a tremendous difference in their quality of life. Employers, on the other hand, they gain by using cheaper labor, but the gains are relatively small. If you look at the profit rates of employers that utilize sweatshops and compare those with the profit rates of employers that do not utilize sweatshops, you find they're basically about the same, which suggests that those employers aren't extracting any tremendous amount of surplus value out of the workers. Like any kind of money saving invention in industry, anything you can do that lowers your costs. Once you do it, your competitors tend to do it too. And
Hmm.
so any profits that appear in the first instance are pretty quickly eaten away by competition.
Okay. So if sweatshops are a good deal for the employer and if they're a good deal for the worker, why are people so upset? I mean, what is there to dislike about sweatshops?
I actually think there's quite a lot to dislike about sweatshops.
Uh-huh.
I think it's important to separate the moral evaluation of the actions that sweatshops are engaged in from our moral evaluation of the character of the persons who perform those actions. And I think oftentimes in our ordinary moral thinking, those two things get conflated. So I think a lot of the people who run sweatshops are probably fairly nasty people, people I wouldn't want to hang around with or be friends with. Um, they're nasty, but they're doing something that makes their employees on the whole better off. Now, they're not doing that because they want to, they're not doing it because they're nice people. Rather, they're doing it because the institutions of market competition tie their hands. They have to make workers better off because, after all, if the package they offer to workers, a package of wages and working conditions, um, wasn't better than anything else the workers had available to them, the workers would go someplace else. So employers make people better off sort of out of necessity. You can imagine them kind of grinding their teeth and wishing they could exploit the workers more. They just aren't able to.
I see. Look, a lot of us, if we had our way, we would shut down every sweatshop in the world tomorrow. I mean, we might do it through a ban legally, or we might do it through boycotts, right? By just refusing to purchase any of these things. Why wouldn't that be a better thing?
So, okay, it might be the case that sweatshops are acting in a way which is morally objectionable. A lot of people think that even if sweatshops provide their workers with a benefit, they're nevertheless acting wrongly in some way, or at least not acting as virtuously as they could be acting. So let's grant all that, right? Let's grant, for the sake of the argument, that sweatshops are treating their workers wrongly. Even if you grant that assumption, it still would not follow that you would want to stop sweatshop labor altogether,
Hmm.
right? Suppose you're in the desert, sort of stranded and starving. When I come across you, I'm the first car you've seen in days, let's say. And being the selfish knave that I am, expert in exploitation,
Right.
I offer to rescue you, but only if you promise to write me a check for $10,000 once we get back to Tucson. Now that's unfair. I think that's a bad thing for me to do. But now, suppose that some third party, some omnipotent third party, had the option of pushing a button, and by pushing that button, they could just stop the transaction from occurring. They could stop me from taking advantage of you in this admittedly unfair way. If they push this button, I disappear, right? And you would be all by yourself again, safe and sound, sort of, and starving in the desert. So the question is, would you want them to push it? I think the answer is no, and tell me why.
Well, okay, but let's go at this another way. I mean, why isn't this a question of consistency? I mean, in the US, for example, employers have to offer their employees certain benefits, like a minimum wage, certain safety standards, limited number of hours per day, per week, and so forth. Why isn't it just a matter of consistency to say if there's reason for them to do it here, there's reason for them to do it in host countries overseas as well?
Right. And there's a lot of things that are contentious among academics who debate ethical issues involving sweatshops. And actually, this isn't one of them. This is one
Hmm.
of the things that almost all sides of the debate agree upon. Some parties of the debate think we ought to have more regulations or more mandated benefits in sweatshops, but almost nobody thinks we ought to have the same level of benefits as we do in the United States. And the reason for that is that safety and benefits are sort of the normal economic goods, right? They're the kind of things that we buy more of the more that we can afford of them. Um, People who work in sweatshops tend to live in relatively poor countries. And living in a relatively poor country means you don't have a lot of options. So that when you choose to spend some of your scarce resources on one good, you inevitably give up on other kinds of goods. Uh, so in the United States, we're a relatively wealthy country.
Hmm.
We have a lot of options. We have a lot of resources. We're willing to trade off some of that wealth for greater safety. We're willing to accept lower wages at work for safer working conditions. People in the developing country, if you made them the choice, and I'm not suggesting that sweatshops offer workers this choice explicitly, but it gets played out in the marketplace. If you did offer them the choice, it's not clear that sweatshop workers would trade off wages for safety. It's not clear that they should trade off wages for additional safety, given how badly they need those wages. And in fact, um, a friend of mine and a co-author, Ben Powell, is an economist. He's actually surveyed some sweatshop workers about this very issue, whether they would in fact trade off wages for a variety of benefits, right? Shorter hours, safer working conditions, more aesthetically pleasing working conditions,
Mm,
and almost always the answer is no. So
mm.
sweatshop workers' own preferences are for higher wages, even when that comes at the expense of other benefits.
Well, that's interesting. So, their preferences are, shaped in large part by their available options. Now, in some cases, a multinational will come in and conditions just are what they are, and given how they are, it's in everybody's interest for a sweatshop to open. But there's a different kind of case where a multinational might come in and say, well, if we collude with local government a bit, maybe we will become everybody's best option.
Right.
Now, those kinds of things happen. Shouldn't our government or somebody be stepping in to forbid that kind of collusion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very tough question to answer with any kind of general principle.
Mm,
I mean, what we can say is this: there's a two nice things about voluntary trade, right? Truly and purely voluntary exchange between two individuals or a firm and an individual. Um, First, voluntary trade respects individual autonomy, and second, voluntary trade, there's at least a very strong presumption that it makes both parties better off. So neither party to the exchange has to enter into the exchange, and so if they do, we can assume that it's because they think they're going to be better off after the exchange than they were before it. Um, Governments, on the other hand, have the power of coercion, which means that they can force their citizens to take a deal, whether it's in their interest to do so or not.
mhm.
So, when governments use that coercive power on behalf of some corporation, I think the presumption of mutual benefit is undermined. It's possible that governments will use their power in a way that benefits their citizens, but there's nothing to guarantee that they will, as there is in the case of voluntary exchange. So it's really not easy to decide in any kind of general way whether we ought to ban these collusive agreements or not. I think that sometimes doing so would improve the lives of citizens and workers, and other times possibly not.
Okay. Um, Look, here's another way in which multinationals might be making things worse. Are they making things worse over time? I mean, for example, um, when we were young, the idea of going to buy a new television and your first choice would be a Korean brand, and your second choice would be another Korean brand, right? This was just not among the options. And yet, I bought a TV a few weeks ago, and that was precisely the order of my preferences. So things have changed in South Korea, at any rate, quite a bit. Um, but isn't there reason to think that sweatshops keep the host countries that they are in from making that kind of progress over time? Aren't they coming in, hiring poor workers, and 30 years later, we still have poor workers without better options?
Yeah, that's a surprisingly common belief. It's surprisingly common given that we have both good theoretical and good empirical reasons for thinking that it is false. So theoretically, right, I think we should expect antecedently that because trade is a mutually beneficial activity, um, that when multinational corporations get involved in a developing country, they are going to contribute at least as much to the domestic economy as they take out. Of course, part of what they contribute will take the form of the wages that they pay to their workers, but they'll also bring physical capital to a country, building buildings and bringing machines there and so forth. And that they also play an important role in the development of human capital in the country, right? So the way sweatshops work is you have some multinational corporation that generally has a contractual relationship with a domestic firm, and it's that domestic firm that's the sweatshop. And rather than sort of sending its own people there to run the whole show, the multinational corporation will instead train some of the domestic workers to oversee the sweatshop. And that training is something that stays in the domestic economy. You now have people who know how to manage workers in a way that they didn't know how to manage workers before. That builds up, and over time, you have an increase in human capital. That human capital can be used outside of the sweatshop in places elsewhere in the economy. So there's a kind of theoretical reason, I think, to expect that sweatshops are going to make an economy better off over time. And empirically, if you look at sort of where sweatshops have been over time, I think you find some confirmation of this theory. So they tend not to stay in the same country for very long. So look
Hmm.
at Nike, for example. Nike was one of the countries that or companies that got in a lot of trouble in the early 2000s for running sweatshops. There were a lot of protests against Nike when I was at the University of Arizona, actually, because University of Arizona's athletic apparel was manufactured by Nike, and
Ah,
charges were made that Nike was employing sweatshop labor. But
mhm.
if you look at where Nike outsourced its production to, it started in Japan. That was the first sort of sweatshop that Nike set up in the middle part of the 20th century. In the 1980s, they moved to South Korea, Taiwan, and then by the late 1990s, they moved again, this time to China and Indonesia. Now, why did this happen? Why was this continual mobility? For instance, became wrong with Japan, right? Japan has good workers, good capital. Well, the simple answer is they got good workers, good capital over time as a result of economic growth. By the time the 1980s came around, Japanese workers had literally better things to do with their time than
Hmm.
work in a sweatshop. They had more opportunities produced by economic growth. More opportunities meant more demand for workers, and as a consequence, higher wages for workers.
Well, thanks. I mean, a lot of people who read your work are going to be people who think about policy and social philosophy, but I mean, the things that you're talking about are of interest to a broader audience. A lot of people who are interested in this are just ordinary citizens who don't know what to think or who don't know what to buy. What kind of advice would you give to the average citizen?
Well, so let me start with some advice that I would not give. I came across this pamphlet, this Shop with a Conscience guide,
Yep.
produced by an organization called Sweat Free Communities. You can Google this, I'm sure, and find it yourself. So they certify these factories, right, as sweat free when the factory pays a decent wage and has as what the organization deems to be good working conditions. Now, Ben Powell, who I mentioned a while ago, actually took this list of factories and sort of plotted them all out on a map. And it turns out that when you do that, all of these factories, or at least the overwhelming majority of them, are in North America, mostly in heavily unionized shops. So what that means is this. So this organization is appealing to consumers' sense of concern for sweatshop workers in the developing world, right? Say, don't buy from sweatshops because they're bad for these people. And they're appealing to that sentiment to try to get you to buy goods produced by workers in the developed world, in the United States or Canada. So what happens if we follow that advice? Uh, are workers in the developing world made any better off? Well, no, absolutely not. The only thing that happens is more money gets channeled away from them and towards workers who are, by global standards, among the world's wealthiest people, right? Even a sort of middle class or lower middle class income earner in the United States is among one of the wealthiest people on the planet. So I think the claim that that's what shopping with a conscience is supposed to look like is hard to defend. I think, look, the short answer to your question is this: if you want to help people who work in sweatshops buy the stuff that they make, the more we increase the demand for the things these workers produce, the more we increase the demand for the workers themselves, and that ultimately means higher wages for people who need it very, very badly.
Okay. All right. Well, let's switch from sweatshops to price gouging. It's a switch from paying too little for something to charging too much for something else. I remember having conversations after the 9/11 attacks. I mean, within days of the attacks, and people were talking about, gasoline prices going up, and there was a lot of outrage over that, saying that it was a kind of price gouging. And here we are, people are exploiting this tragedy to try to make more money on fuel. Um, so let me ask you this question. How can it be okay to hike prices on essential goods during an emergency? I mean, that's when people need these things most. Shouldn't merchants be charging the same price? If anything, shouldn't merchants be charging a lower price if they were acting with a good conscience?
Right. So, so here's what I take to be the important grain of truth in that argument, right? When emergencies strike, when people are placed in a vulnerable position, good people ought to try to do what they can to help them, right? And when we see acts of price gouging, it looks like people are doing precisely the opposite. It looks like people are taking advantage of vulnerability to line their own pockets. And that strikes us as not just morally wrong, it strikes us as morally repugnant. So that I think is what's going on with a lot of people's thoughts on price gouging. And as I said, there's an important grain of truth there. We ought to try to help people who need our help. What happens though if we freeze prices in the wake of disasters, as anti-price gouging laws will sometimes do, or we insist that people lower their prices, is not necessarily that people get helped. In fact, it might actually hurt the very people that we're trying to help. So what you want to happen in an emergency is for stuff to go to the people who needs it most. Stuff like electrical generators or water bottles or sandbags or whatever it is. The problem is that in an emergency situation, there's almost never enough stuff to go around. So someone's not going to get the stuff they need, and charging a low price for the stuff doesn't change that fact. It just means that the stuff's going to be snapped up by whoever stumbles across it first. So if you're selling water for 50 cents a bottle, let's say, when I think power might be out for a week, I might not just buy a bottle, I might buy a whole stock of water just to be on the safe side in case the power is out longer than I expect. Now, higher prices don't guarantee that stuff is going to go to the people who needs it, but it does two things to help. First, higher prices encourage consumers to conserve. My house, for instance, is damaged in a storm, and hotel rooms cost $50 a night. I might very well buy one room for my wife and I and another room for my kids just to be comfortable. But if rooms cost $200 a night, I'll probably crowd us all into the same room. I might even decide that my damaged house isn't that bad after all, and I'll just stay home and tough it out for a night or two. Right? When consumers conserve, when they don't consume as much stuff as they could, then there's more stuff left for people who might need it more. The second thing that high prices do, the second way in which high prices might actually help people in need, is by encouraging potential suppliers to bring more stuff to the market. So if I could buy a bottle of water for 50 cents in San Diego and sell it for $5 in Los Angeles, it might be worth it for me to make a trip. Right? People are incredibly benevolent and kind, I think, when disasters strike in the United States. But I think if you really want to help to get stuff where it's needed, you don't want to rely on benevolence alone. You want to make it in people's self-interest to help. And price increases can do that in one important way.
Okay, so let's suppose that prices go up and that's actually good for people who are in greatest need. But of course, the people setting those prices are merchants, and they're not looking after those needs, they're just looking after their own interests. Why shouldn't there be somebody else, some impartial third party, a government agency, say, or a law that sets those prices in times of emergency?
Right, and in a way, that's exactly what anti-gouging laws try to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So those states that have anti-gouging laws effectively set a maximum price on a variety of emergency-related goods, sometimes listed explicitly and sometimes just categorized in a general way. Sometimes they say that no price increases are permitted after the governor typically has declared a state of emergency. Sometimes they say that price increases are limited to 10%, or sometimes they say that price increases are limited to whatever the good costs plus a certain amount. But all of them try to set in some way a legally maximum price that merchants can charge. And there's two kind of pragmatic problems, I think, with doing this. Well, sorry, one big pragmatic problem I'll just classify as one. The most significant problem is this: nobody really has any idea what the price ought to be on certain goods in order to achieve the outcome that they want, namely getting stuff to the people who needs it, right? So suppose your city's just suffered a blackout and people are snapping up electrical generators. Where do you set the price, right? Do you cap it at 10% over its prior price, 20%? Do you set a price cap on flashlights too? If so, is it the same amount? Is it less? Is it more? How you want to get enough of a price increase in the allowed in the system to encourage people to conserve on scarce resources. You also want to, again, allow enough of a price increase to provide an incentive for people to actually sell the stuff. But it's very, very difficult, in fact, arguably impossible for anyone sitting in an office by themselves to come up with that price. So what we have in a market system is we have a bunch of people coming up with prices on their own, and this process of competition kind of sorts out good prices from the bad. It's exactly the kind of thing that Friedrich Hayek was talking about in his famous article on the use of knowledge in society, where he thought that the sort of abolition of prices in a centrally planned socialist economy would make economic planning impossible. This is the same problem just on a smaller scale. Prices convey useful information about supply and demand, but only if those prices are allowed to emerge freely from the actions of buyers and sellers in the market. If you try to substitute those prices, the commands of a legislator, that legislator is going to be acting largely in the dark.
Okay, so perhaps it should be merchants who set prices, but merchants can set their prices anywhere they want. So what am I, as someone who might be facing a disaster, and I have all kinds of things that I need, or my family needs, my children needs, how am I to know that I'm going to be able to afford those things?
Well, you won't always be able to afford them. I mean, one of the virtues of higher prices is that they help people, even those who can't afford to pay the higher price, right? So if electrical generators are selling for $1,500 in the wake of a hurricane, and you can't afford to pay that $1,500, then you don't get the generator. But what one thing that $1,500 does is prevent you from buying the generator. Another thing it does, though, is it signals more people to bring generators into the market because, hey, there's a huge profit here to be made. However, the more people bring generators into the market, the higher supply of generators is, and the lower price generators go. So kind of paradoxically, you benefit from high prices even when you can't afford to pay them. But what's to stop merchants from charging whatever they want on a good? Well, in a sense, nothing. There's no legal prohibition, but in a sense, there is something. So one of the cases I talk about in my price gouging paper involves some kids who bought a bunch of ice for it was ice or water, I forget what it was, for like $1.70 a bag in one town, and then drove it to another town that had been hit by a hurricane and sold it for $12 a bag. Now that seems nasty, right? But why didn't they sell it for $20 a bag? Why didn't they sell it for $50 a bag? Clearly, there are some forces there that were operating to check their naked self-interest, or at least constrain their naked self-interest, to prevent them from charging just whatever they wanted for the goods that people needed.
Okay, so suppose I'm one of the people living in this town that's just been hit by a hurricane, and I need ice, perhaps, to keep my medicine preserved or something like that. And somebody comes along and they're selling it for $12 a bag. Now, I can afford that. Okay, so I pay the $12 and off I go. But of course, if somebody came up to me in the night and put a knife in my back and said, your wallet or your life, well, I could afford to give them my wallet, right? But that's clearly an illegitimate exchange. So why aren't these two kinds of exchanges in just the same bag?
Right, right. With the mugger, you're given his threat of your money or your life, you really are better off giving him your wallet than you are keeping it. So why isn't this just another case of mutually beneficial exchange? So the difference is between threats and offers, right? What the mugger does is threaten you, and a threat is something that proposes to make you worse off than you already are, unless you do what the threatener requests of you. So the mugger threatens to make you worse off than you were before, right? Before you had both your money and your life and you got to keep both. He's saying unless you hand over wallet, I guess you get to keep neither, right? Now, presumably after he kills you, he'll take your wallet too. That's how a threat works. Price gouging, though, doesn't really involve threats. Price gouging involves offers, and offers are proposals that make you better off if you do what the proposer suggests, right? So a price gouger offers you a product and says, if you want to hand over your money in exchange for this product, you can do so. If you don't, of course, right? If you don't want to hand over your money for the product, well, you don't have to, right? So the difference is, once a proposal comes along, you're no worse off if you reject it than you would have been if the proposal had never come along in the first place. And if it's a good proposal, you might be better off if you take it. That's not the way threat works.
Okay. Matt, one more question. I'm trying to think of how price gouging laws affect commerce. So, for instance, imagine two neighboring states. One has price gouging laws, the other doesn't have any price gouging laws. Does that make any difference to corporations who are trying to decide where to sell their goods?
You'd think a priori that it would, but I really wish there was more good empirical work on this subject than there is. There just isn't much. I don't know if it's just because it's very difficult to run these kind of studies or what the explanation is, but if any economists are watching this, I hope they go out and do this kind of work. Um, Most of the evidence we have, unfortunately, is just theoretical, right? So I can tell you a theoretical story about why it should make a difference, um, or it's anecdotal. But we have some good anecdotes, right? So there was a state of emergency declared in West Virginia in 2009, and once the state of emergency was declared, this set the state's anti-gouging laws into effect, and that limited price increases on certain classes of goods to 10% above the cost of that good. Um, so shortly after this occurred, there was a major petroleum supplier who declared explicitly that it was going to halt shipments to West Virginia altogether because it simply wasn't worth their while economically to do them anymore, given the maximum price that was now in effect. Um, and that's the troublesome thing about anti-gouging laws, right? They prohibit merchants from charging too much money from goods that they're selling, but they don't. And I mean, I guess they couldn't if they wanted to prohibit merchants from just not selling the goods at all. And unfortunately, the less economically worthwhile you make selling by capping the prices, the more attractive not selling at all becomes as an option, even though it looks like that's the worst of all possible worlds for consumers.
Well, Matt, it's been great talking to you as always.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this, Dan. Thank you for having me.
All right, well, thanks for your time.
Appreciate it.